the ones with the 8 questions?
Yeah, the document I sent you.
Okay.
I'll just read out the first one. So Trump's presidential term has ended now. What is the current political state of affairs in Israel-Palestine 4 years later? And what do you expect from a Biden presidency?
Well, I'm going to take the middle question first, and that will kind of answer the other 2 questions. I don't like to be an obituarist, and I take no satisfaction in it. But the Palestine cause is dead. You know, causes live and die. I'm not saying it's dead forever. I find it improbable that it's dead forever. But for the time being, it's passed through a period that's left it at the end morally, spiritually bereft, empty. It's not the first time this has happened. After the expulsion of the Palestinians in 1948, there was not much said of the Palestinian cause again until after the 1967 war, when the Palestinian guerrilla movement emerged. But for the period from, let's call it 1950 to 67, the Palestine cause, it was used and exploited by people like Nasser to bolster his pan-Arab pretensions, but as a living cause of the people, not as a puppet to be manipulated by regional powers. As a living cause, it was pretty much, let's call it moribund. It emerges again after 67, and then it has a pretty long run until, you could say, after the Lebanon War. After the 1982 Lebanon War, the Palestinian leadership goes into exile, and the cause again seems dead. As a matter of fact, when Chomsky, Professor Chomsky, when he wrote his book, The Fateful Triangle, which was really, for its time, it was quite an extraordinary work. When he wrote The Fateful Triangle, he ends on a very pessimistic note. He says, the cause is over. And when Edward Said, Professor Said, reviewed Chomsky's book in the London Review of Books, he disagreed. He said, no, it's not dead. It's not over. And at that particular point, Professor Said proved to be correct. The cause again emerges in 1987, the end of 87, namely with the First Intifada. And from the First Intifada, there were ebbs and flows. There was the disaster of Oslo, but then there was a second attempt at resistance in the early 2000s, what was called incorrectly, in my opinion, the Second Intifada. And now that period is over. The rotten fruit of Oslo had 2 main impacts. When I say Oslo, I mean the Oslo Agreement of 1993, September 1993. The 2 main impacts were it put in place a collaborationist regime, a kind of Bantustan leadership. And number 2, the Palestinian people had soured of politics, grown cynical of politics. Their experience had showed them that for all of their sacrifice, all of their heroism, all of their courage, all they got for it was this rotten collaborator regime. And so they gave up on politics. There is no politics any longer in Palestine. So politics, when I say politics, I don't mean an isolated act of resistance here or an isolated act of resistance there. I mean a large mass movement in resistance to the occupation. And then on top of that, but not totally beside the point, not totally separate from it, was the regional factor. And the regional factor had basically two components. Component number one, the Arab world has polarized around the Iran versus, they say Sunni versus Shia, but I don't want to use that. The Iran versus, let's just call it the Iran camp versus the Saudi camp. And the Saudi camp, because it's constituted by parasitic regimes who have no concept of work, no cultural, no intellectual contributions they've ever made, the Saudis and the Gulf so-called states, they were no match really for Iran. Iran has a rich civilization, very, very smart, a lot of very smart people, impressive. And they realized they were no match for Iran. And so they became more desperate for some outside power to pull their chestnuts out of the fire. And as they went from one debacle to another, the debacle in Yemen, the debacle in Syria, they realized that they were not even dependent as they were on hiring others to do their dirty work. There were no fighting force. And so they decided to invest in the US and Israel openly. They'd always quietly, obviously, done it. And with the US, it wasn't quiet, but now it was an open alliance. And so there was no regional support now for the Palestinians. And then the second factor was the Arab world imploded in the meantime. And that meant that the Palestinian cause as a unique humanitarian situation, it no longer loomed large. You had Yemen, you still have Yemen, Libya, Syria, Iraq, further away, but still part of the general picture, Afghanistan. The whole Arab world was is a humanitarian catastrophe. And so the suffering of Palestine, with the partial exception of Gaza, I say partial because I don't think Gaza is actually worse than Yemen right now. With the partial exception of Gaza, the humanitarian resonance of the Palestine crisis has significantly diminished. So now, and also because the Palestinian cause have become so corrupt, because it lost all of its international stature, the Arab world felt very at ease in publicly abandoning it. There was no pressure anymore. Um, Palestine obviously never had any material power, natural resources, an army, a fighting force. It never had any of that. But it had an enormous amount of what you might call symbolic power. The Arab world, the Arab regimes were genuinely afraid of the Palestinians, not because they were a fighting force, but because if you wronged the Palestinians, you were going to create a domestic problem for yourselves. The Palestinian cause had a lot of resonance, moral resonance, with what's called, I hate the expression, but I'll just use it now, with the Arab street. But that's all gone. So they realized, the Arab regimes, they could openly align with the West and Israel and not lose any moral or political capital in the process. There were no demonstrations, no outrage when the UAE and Bahrain opened relations with Israel. It was nothing. So when you add up all those factors, there's no cause left. And of course, there's suffering, but there's no political cause. And one has to make a distinction between a humanitarian crisis, of which is real, and a political cause, which is no longer real. So that kind of answers the other two questions. What will the Biden administration do? Probably nothing, because it will just be ignored. Israel will be given a free hand to do as it pleases, and there won't be any international repercussions of what Israel does, because there's no internal leadership of the Palestinians and there's no regional support for it. So it'll be nothing. It'll be a zero. And that's where I think things stand. Incidentally, those aren't easy words for me to say. I devote really the whole of my adult life to the Palestinian cause. It consumed me. So it's a sobering fact that it's gone. But first of all, I want to make clear, I don't believe it's over. I think the Palestinian cause will probably reemerge maybe in 10 years or 20 years when I'm gone. And it will reemerge as a civil rights movement like in South Africa. I think the two-state phase is over, because for the Palestinian people, the two states has only negative memories for them. For them, two states is November 1988, they formally adopt the two-state platform. November 1988 then culminates in 1993, September 1993, with the Oslo Accord. And so the Oslo Accord marks the peak of the two-state strategy. And the Oslo Accord was quickly followed by the disintegration of the Palestinian cause. So in the mindset of Palestinians, two states will always be associated with the disaster of Oslo. And so I think it will be very hard to revive any interest in Oslo. Excuse me,